Good afternoon. Welcome to another edition of Artist and Critic. I'm Don Gray. With us today is a very exciting figurative painter, Francis Cunningham. Mr. Cunningham has had many one-man shows in New York, in Washington, D.C., and elsewhere. His last three shows have been at the Herschel and Adler Gallery in Manhattan. The last show, as a matter of fact, taking place this past March. Francis Cunningham also teaches at the Brooklyn Museum Art School. Nice to have you with us, Francis. Thanks for coming. What are you after in your art, Francis? You're a realist painter of what subjects? What is the subject of your art, would you say?
Well, the subject of my art, Don, I think, is the figure and objects and landscape, because I do both still life painting and landscape and figure pieces and portraits. What I'm after, I think, was a good way to lead into the whole thing, because what I'm after is the object, whether the object is a human being or a piece of still life or whatever.
How do you happen, this may be a little difficult question, but how do you happen to be pursuing these interests in a time when abstraction and non-objectivity and the merest scribble on a museum wall passes for art? How come you have such serious interests?
I guess the reason for that, that gets right into a life question of how you feel about things, and I put life ahead of art. And I think I feel about abstraction and also about the day we're living in, that art tends to serve life instead of life serving art. And my feelings towards people and towards the figure or towards the objects I paint and towards the landscape I paint, it's going out to that. That's where the stimulus is coming from, and not from painting for the sake of painting art for art's sake, which I have no sympathy with.
Just sheer aesthetics for their own sake, red against blue or rough against smooth or whatever.
Right. Doesn't mean I can't enjoy some of the work that comes out of this, and that some of it isn't fine art, but it's not for me.
Have you encountered any difficulties in your art career in the fact that you are a figurative painter dealing with realism, with the things around us and feeling for them, whereas the majority of artists, I would say, have been dealing with more or less sort of an impersonal, not even a reaction to the world, as you were saying, just playing with aesthetics more or less. What difficulties have you encountered being a realist artist?
Well, that's a real long one, because that heads right into you might say almost, what difficulty, period. That is the difficulty I found, or that is the problem of being a realist painter today, or at least being myself, and I happen to be a realist painter, is having your work looked at for what it is, and not in terms of something else. I guess what I might say is that it seems to me that we're living in a really very kind of plastic age. It's all around us, and people aren't plastic.
Right.
And the kind of approach to the human figure, I mean, I think you can't stop an observer of a painting, of a figure, responding to that painting and wondering about what is the emotional life of the sitter.
Exactly.
What is the psychological aspects? How is this connected with the physical appearance? I mean, a human being is a complete thing.
Sinews, blood, psyche, and spirit.
Right.
And
It's all the form and all the space and all the technical things that you as a painter know about as I do, but it's also much more than that.
Content, really. It comes down to content,
it comes down to content, and it comes down towards the attitude towards your subject. And I think my particular attitude towards my subjects, whether they be figure or still life or landscape, create definite problems. You have to accept the subject, you see. The paintings are not about painting, or they're not about technique, or they're not about painting a figure and leaving out the psychological or emotive qualities.
We're going to be looking at some of your pictures in just a moment, but before we do people hunger today for reality? Are we separated, as you seem to imply? Our society separates us from ourselves and deals with artificial values. We're somewhat overwhelmed, I think, by our own technology. I'm not sure if you'd agree or not. We've lost touch with our humanity. Do people hunger for realistic paintings of substance? Would you
Well,
say?
I'd very much agree with what you've just been saying, and I do feel that indeed people, after all, people have bodies, people eat fruit, vegetables and things of this sort, you know. I guess perhaps a little bit what I'm saying about that is that if you've been brought up on McDonald's, you know, and
Yeah.
you live in a situation, as most of us do, in an urban situation where you shop at the supermarket and your taste becomes formed by this type of plastic experience. I mean, McDonald's is not food, it's plastic. And you go into the supermarket and you unwrap a piece of, the piece of meat is wrapped in plastic with a
Exactly.
vegetable dye, and you know,
Yeah.
even if you know what you're looking for in a good cut, why, and that problem is true with painting too. I think a lot of the art of the 20th century has been very much dealing with severe shapes, whether they're metal boxes or on a two-dimensional surface, and to suddenly fling out the thing at people, it's surprising. If people hunger for it, yes, I think people do.
They do, and in a sense maybe having some difficulty in responding to it because we've been away from it so long, as you're
Yeah,
saying, to a
right.
degree. I wonder if we can begin to move toward some of Francis Cunningham's paintings here and can we get our cameras to start to pick up some of Francis Cunningham's paintings? And while we move, set ourselves up for that. So you're saying really the art that is somewhat artificial today is reflecting our artificial society, and the fact that even our meats, our foods, almost aren't real anymore. There's so many dyes injected into them, and artificial coloring, and the prepackaged, everything has lost its original form and shape and color and so forth.
I think pop art is a natural consequence of the way we live, you might say.
And expresses it, I guess,
Yeah,
really the
yeah.
artificiality of it and the product oriented. Francis, what is this first picture of yours here of this elderly woman?
This is a painting of Mimi Sherb, who I think probably every serious art student in New York City in the last 20 years has run across Mimi. But she's an extraordinary model, has been a professional model, began as a dancer and was in all kinds of films, bit parts in Hollywood. I'd worked with her as a student, then worked with her in Sheffield, where I have a summer place, and I'd done a number of paintings and drawings of her, but I'd lost touch with her, and she came and posed in a class of mine at the Art Students League, rather at the Brooklyn Museum School. And her husband had died. There was a sense of sorrow and resignation, and that I said, Mimi, let's do a painting, and that was the result.
And the beautiful, aged, sinewy, slightly growing, increasingly flaccid body, that's reality, isn't it? That's the beauty of the human body, not in the a movie screen version of it, but what
Yes.
happens to all our
Yes.
bodies, and nothing artificial about it, the whole
And Mimi
real
has, which
quality.
of course you can't see on black and white television, but the most exquisite skin tones of any human being I've ever laid
Does
eyes
she?
on. Yes.
Great for a model. Francis, who is this lady posing for the portrait?
Well, this is a painting of Mrs. I. Rabi. She is the wife of the Nobel physicist. Perhaps you saw the New Yorker profiles. There were a couple of profiles
you were
that we
mentioning
mentioned
that. Right.
on him. And this painting came about just, she and Dr. Rabi were on their way to a Columbia charter day meeting or something, and I happened to be in the daughter's house. They're great friends of ours, and this Mrs. Rabi had this dress. It was so elegant. And I said, Mrs. Rabi, you must be painted. She said, see me in the fall. And
you did see her in the fall.
and I did see her in the fall.
What were you after in that picture, before we move to the next one? Were you after a sense of her character and her
Oh, yes.
any suggestion of social standing, or
well,
more or
it
less
was,
a personal firmness or force that...
She is an extraordinary woman,
Yes, sir.
and the the age, the dignity. She insisted on standing for this, and I'm sure it was well over 100 sittings.
Oh.
Because the lines of the dress would not show seated, and without a complaint, of course. And
She seemed a woman of great spirit and strength.
Great,
is the way you portrayed her.
Of great character.
Yeah, right. Who was this older gentleman sitting in his chair?
He's a woodsman friend of mine, and a very close friend in Sheffield, Floyd Woodbeck. I think he has perhaps the fastest mind of anyone I have ever encountered, just
Picks
like
things
that.
right up.
He also is the finest man with an axe one could deal with. As I say, a close friend who was arthritic in his youth. I think it shows in the pose and the way the disposition of the arms and legs, hands and feet and so forth.
In these first three pictures, you seem to be so interested in character of the people, which goes back to your saying that trying to get in touch with the reality of things again. You're not using them as an excuse for a painterly exercise, although you're entirely in command of your painterly tools, but it's so nice to see you working with these.
Well, it's fun in a way to really talk about it like this, Dom, because it comes out, as I say, the response comes out to the subject, which is where it began.
Right, exactly. I understand the picture coming up of this male nude caused a certain amount of problems with you during your last show at Herschel Adler.
It certainly did. It was in the catalog and hung on the walls for the opening, and I discovered in the middle of the next week that the gallery had taken it down and it was in the back room. I think, we think that in the 20th century these things don't happen. The reason I was told was a wealthy client would be horrified by this. I tried to explain that it seemed to me that Pat Brown was more related to the Greek Kouroi than he was to anything pornographic, but we've had a parting as a result of, in part.
There's hardly anything suggestive about the pose. I mean, it's simply very contemplative and very restrained, really. Was it exhibited at all, or was it up for 3 or 4 days before the client?
Yes, I had to go to the gallery and talk to the head and say, I'm awfully sorry, but either the painting goes back up immediately this morning or the entire show comes down. And we worked out a compromise, and the painting went back up.
Oh, it did go back up?
It went back up for the remainder of the show.
But then what, your relations with the gallery were irretrievably...
We've terminated.
Would you care to go?
I think happily on both parts.
Would you care to go into more detail about that? How you terminated it, or would you rather not?
Well, I was up against a situation, very understandable for the gallery, where I think they made something like $240 out of that show, and there were many of these pieces that you're looking at now, and it wasn't a little show. Actually, the third show I'd had at that gallery. And I made something like $260.
You made $260
Yes,
from this
one
show?
small painting was sold. It's not too easy to make a living as a painter.
What?
Of course, big
can't...
pieces of that sort are,
How large was that painting?
That's life-size.
Life-size?
It was a life-size nude, yeah.
No, I can't let this go untouched, Francis. You're saying this. How could paintings of such obvious quality and solidity and expertise and a feeling for people and character go unsold in a gallery of the standing of Herschel and Adler, who would seemingly have a fairly sensitive clientele?
Don, I think my paintings are out of the line of Herschel and Adler. In fact, one of the senior members of the gallery said, "You're no longer painting your classic still lives and saleable landscapes." I think what we're talking about is an aspect of the art world that, in which quality, of course, is subordinate to money, and you can understand this in a way. I suppose they're out to make a living. When it comes in contact with a contemporary painter, if I did small still lives that would sell, I could be there forever, and they would do very well, and they have a clientele for that. If it comes to going past, you might almost say the decorator aspect of the fine arts, and unfortunately the big figure pieces that I had, certainly the nudes, cut through that. it makes trouble. People can get offended. A wealthy client who has, bought $500,000 worth of paintings for the last couple of years, if he says, if there's any question that he will be offended by a male nude, of course the male nude goes down, and there we are. That's the kind of situation it is.
Well, anybody familiar with the art world realizes this, and I know what you're talking about, but I have to ask this to probe it, because it still angers me to a great deal that artists are often put into this trap where they are expected to copy themselves and endlessly produce whatever was a successful piece, whether it was sailboats or apples or, as you're saying, small, easily disposable still lives in a sense, and they are never expected to evolve or grow as human beings or creative beings. It is absolutely a horrendous situation where creativity comes in conflict with commercialism.
It's terrific pressure on the artist in New York, Don, obviously. And of course, when a painter finds that he can do something and that sells, and he has to eat. An artist is a human being.
Right.
There's terrific pressure to do exactly that, and of course a great many very gifted people wind up doing that.
Right.
No art, real art, can ever come out of such an impulse.
No,
I tend to think that America wants art, but it doesn't want artists.
What do you mean by that? Something safe to hang on the wall, but they don't want living creatures that cause problems by looking at things too
The artist,
truthfully?
unfortunately, is apt to cause problems. He's not apt to follow a party line, whether it comes from a gallery or other groups of artists or anybody else.
Right.
And
If they could have collars around all the artists' necks and lead them docilely down any road they wanted, they'd be happier. I kind of agree with you. Speaking of still lifes, Francis, what is the subject of this still life, and why did you paint this?
well, I've called accoutrements of trapping, and Floyd Woodbeck, the woodsman in the gray that I showed you looked at earlier. Those are some of his tools. Actually, that's a wolf trap. Ricardo Belden, who was the last Shaker, great difference. The Shaker sect up in Hancock, you may know about. That belonged to him, and he gave it to Floyd. It's a boning knife, and the scales and various other implements. That's the skin of a small animal would be stretched over that
Form.
cathedral-looking like form. Yes, yes.
Very dynamic.
I've done a lot of still life material from Shaker things. I love the purity and the cleanliness and the integrity of their objects. And Dr. Robbie was asking me not long ago, why didn't I paint 20th century objects? And the reason that I said to him is, look, everything is prefabricated, mass-produced in our day. If you take a wrench, for instance, that comes from 1920, you get an automobile wrench, they're marvelous things. They do all kinds of specific tasks, you might say, and they're beautifully made, even if those were factory made, and I guess most of them were. You go back to 1910 and you get the same kind of wrench for a buggy. And you go back even earlier, of course. But you come into our time and you know what you get when you go out. I said, what do you have by way of physics equipment? And he said, well, you know, when I did my original experiments, we built our own stuff for next to nothing. I said, my God, let me look at it.
Right,
You know, and he said, alas, destroyed.
Oh, dear. Yeah, well, ours is a shoddy age. There's no doubt about it. And in the picture on the screen now, you look like you are perhaps harking back to a simpler time, in a sense, at least getting away from some of the urban razzle-dazzle. Is this again up
This is in
where
the
you live
Berkshires,
yeah.
up in Sheffield. And you've described it. I mean, the Berkshires are very beautiful. If you've been there,
lovely.
you know what it's
Exactly.
like. This is a painting. The barn in that painting is all gone. The land has been divided up into building lots. 5-acre building lots for wealthy owners of second homes. It might interest one to know that the young people in Sheffield and Mill River and Marlborough and the towns around in here are just plain leaving. They're going to Colorado, they're going all over the place. You can't buy land. The land values
So
have gone
expensive.
up. Now maybe with all of this economic business it will go down, but right now it's like that. this happened to be right next door to where I live, and the farm had, 20 years ago, the second finest Holstein herd in the United States. The old Arnold Brewer, who ran the farm, designed the first hay drying equipment in the United States, you know? And on a point of fact, a friend of mine wound up by buying that farm, farming it for 7 years at a tax loss, and then just sold it off like that. Auctioned the equipment and material, got a record to come in, and that barn was down in 2 weeks. The limestone farm had been in the same family, you know, for 3 generations.
Oh, tragic.
So it's, I suppose, a little bit, we think that artists are I guess that's why I don't live in Soho, you see. I like the larger community, and my concerns are not
The limited concerns, aesthetic concerns of
art.
Yeah.
It
It
concerns me,
encompasses-
this kind of thing.
Yeah, I was gathering that this is progress. In quotation marks, isn't it?
Well,
when
it's
you
life,
take
I
this
guess.
beautiful farm with the barn and the trees and the wide-spreading landscape,
Yeah.
and you subdivide it into these, even for 5-acre lots are better than 5 houses on an acre.
It's
But-
gone,
but
believe
it's
me,
gone.
it's
Yeah,
gone.
it's tragic
Yeah.
also.
Yeah.
This man, hooded man, might symbolize the figure mourning the passing of that farm in a sense.
Well, actually, he's a Spanish dancer.
Is he? All right, he's not.
Jose Barrera, and he turns out to be the first Spanish dancer I ever saw. That was at Jacob's Pillow about 10 years ago. He's working for the Far Gallery now, and
Oh, I have to look at
It,
him closely. I think I have encountered him at the Far Gallery, as a matter of
it's
fact. I'm
one of
sorry.
those things where Jose posed, and we started out. He made me the most beautiful vest. He gave it to me as a present because he liked my paintings. And I was going to make a drawing of him and his wife. No, he wasn't too happy about that. Well, a painting, well, that was better. And then I began to get going, you know. I said, Jose, how about a life-size painting? So, yes, why not? And he had these wonderful things. And, you know, again, you're standing up there with your arm like that and so forth. And after his work at the Far Gallery, he would come over and
And struggle to pose. It's not easy to
take the
pose.
pose.
Right.
So I have 2 magnificent vests, and he has that painting. The painting got done.
I'd love to see it. Of course, we're looking at them reduced size and photographed without the color, but the sincerity and the ability certainly comes through in all these pictures. Which artists do you admire? Before we go to, well, there's a beautiful still life coming up, but which artists have you admired, past or present?
I'm very, very Catholic in my taste. I like work by minor men if it's first-class work. And I can't say, for instance, that I love Botticelli and prefer him to Raphael. It depends on what the work is. And the same with the 20th century, and the same with Oriental art or East Indian art. It's it's either a work of art and it moves your spirit through the eye, or it isn't, and it can come up in many different forms.
It can be a Rembrandt and do it, or be a Rembrandt and not do it, I guess, depending on the work, more or less.
I must say, I feel a great affinity, and it was one of the very happy things about being at Herschel and Adler's, that they have marvelous 19th century, 18th and 19th century American painting, and I, in a sense, discovered my heritage as an American. I found myself composing in certain ways, and then here it was with a whole group of painters that I really wasn't familiar with, you know. So I have strong feelings for my American past,
Ancestors.
for that kind of tough-minded attitude towards things of a Thomas Aiken, certainly, but other people like Francis, some of these Philadelphia painters, marvelous still life painters, marvelous. Fitzhugh Lane, a great marine painter.
If you hark back to these 19th century strong men, so to speak, do you feel lonely and isolated in the 20th century? Do you feel that you would be happier in another time, since
Absolutely
this time has so gone awry?
I feel very strictly 1975, and in fact, if I go looking for a gallery again, I really would much prefer to go perhaps to a Soho gallery which handles not 19th century type of painting or academic realism, but I would rather exhibit with some non-objective painters and things of that sort, because if you look into the work further, there's much more in common in spirit there than
You mean in terms of the 20th century spirit in your work?
yeah.
Yeah, no, I wasn't saying you were from out of the past, but I meant just as a man, did you feel lonely and isolated when most of your artistic brothers are not interested in what you're interested in?
Too busy painting and living to worry about that.
Okay. Could you talk about this really simple, yet very seemingly simple, let's put it this way, but obviously very controlled and thoughtfully planned still life of, what is it, 2 pumpkins, a pitcher, and a...
It's a tin pitcher, which comes from the shaker. I was able to borrow that. It took 2 days to get some of these tools, but I was able to borrow that from the Shaker Museum in Hancock, and 3 gourds. Yeah, I like talking about that because I grew the gourds. And when I paint still life objects, I don't go to the supermarket. I mean, for instance, if I paint apples, well, I did a piece there were just 3 or 4 apples in it, 3 apples to be precise, but they're Baldwin apples, and they're picked from the best tree in Sheffield, you know.
Your tree?
No, it's on somebody else's land.
You filtered across the stone wall.
Right, but you feel very differently about it, and these are the objects I take, like the people I paint, are
part of your life.
they're part of my life, yes.
Right, they've come from your background and your surroundings. I happen to live on a farm myself, and the still life objects that I paint I've grown in my garden too, so I know exactly what you're saying. Who is this? We're getting into a slightly different dimension. The pose is a little more relaxed, perhaps, and of course the religious aspect. Is it a brother or a father?
No, it's a portrait of the Reverend Walter Wright, who was a minister in Sheffield. Very interesting man. He was an Episcopalian. He was a man who was absolutely beloved by Jews, Catholics, atheists, Congregationalists, and where I guess he got into trouble with his own kind. Just an extraordinary human being of great dignity and breadth and great sense of fun, and he was willing to sit, and we discussed poetry and all kinds of things, and theology and so forth.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Francis, I'm sorry, time, our great enemy, or maybe the friend of artists, I'm not sure whether it is, has caught up with us. We've had an enjoyable conversation this afternoon with Francis Cunningham. Terrific painter, great painter, teacher at the Brooklyn Museum Art School, and if you ever see his paintings advertised on exhibit, go by and see them because they're terrific. You've been watching Artist and Critic. I'm Don Gray. Have a nice afternoon. Bye-bye.